In the 90s, there were several televised trials cases that became part of the public imagination and heavily impacted the way modern true crime looks. O.J. Simpson, Tonya Harding, Lorena Bobett, and the Menéndez Brothers. All of these have been examined and re-examined in the past decade. Most recently, the Menéndez Brothers, who were mocked for their claims of childhood abuse, have recently seen evidence show up that backs up their claims. In 1996, brothers Lyle and Erik Menendez were found guilty of the 1989 murders of their parents. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Due to their actions before and during the trial, the brothers were heavily parodied, lambasted, and mocked.
Yes. Yeah.
At the trial, part of their defense was the brothers expressed being emotionally, physically, and sexually abused by their father, and that their actions came from fearing for their lives. The prosecution argued that they did it for money, inheritance, and that their claims of sexual abuse were a lie. For as long as I've ever heard about the Menendez brothers, in many of the true crime podcasts that I have consumed over the years, the narrative has always been they were liars. They were doing it for the money, and they just got caught because they were stupid. Except, due to new evidence, this might not be the case. A member of the popular group Menudo has come out saying that they allege that they were being sexually abused by their father, Jose Menendez.
The testimony that Erik and Lyle needed when they were sentenced to life.
And what I think is interesting about this new evidence and other evidence that has come up in the past 30 years about the brothers is not so much the gotcha of culture got it wrong, because I think we know that that happens all the time. But what is the responsibility of us as people who consume this material of dealing with it? How do we deal with something that was assumed correct for decades, now having a new reality to it? How do we deal with the fact that our media gives us ideas of who are heroes, who are villains, and we just tend to accept it until told otherwise? I am sorry that this video is a back-to-back bummer with the Anna Hesh video. I originally had a video planned around, of all things, South Park, and how the relationship between Heidi and Cartman is very emblematic of abusive relationships. I don't know how this became my beat. Then the strike happened, and even though South Park is not a struck show, I want to be in solidarity with the workers in SGA and in the WGA, and so I am putting that to the back burner for a while and focusing on other kinds of content that I wanted to speak about, from history to true crime and book stuff. So I hope that you will enjoy that as we are working on it. I do have some pop culture takes that I'm doing on my Patreon and on Nebula. So if you really want that content, it is there, but I don't want to be in the public eye of YouTube promoting that kind of material out of solidarity. I also want to say, as I said in a short before, thank you to everyone who subscribed to my Patreon. It has been a grueling couple of months, and financially things are just so hard due to Lola being sick, and also just the realities of living in a very expensive city where the cost of living is really high and health insurance is absolutely necessary and yet a fucking burden amongst burdens. So just thank you to everyone who joined the Patreon. If you like my work, please join me on Patreon if you can. I have very reasonable tiers. We do movie nights, pilot watches. We are going to be doing a One Piece watch thing where we're going to be watching a lot of One Piece, and God knows how that's going to turn out, but it's going to be fun. We do the Witcher book club. That has been super fun. So there's a lot of good stuff to get. So if you like what I do, you like my work, now's an excellent time to support me on Patreon. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of everything else, let's get a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Nebula, the creator co-owned platform that I and many others are a part of. I've spoken about Nebula countless times, but if you are new, it is a place where many of your favorite content creators, especially in the queer and BIPOC spaces, make their content that isn't necessarily always fit for YouTube. Some exclusives that have come out are Maggie Mayfish just wrapped up her 6-part unrated series all about the history of sex in movies. Jessie Gender is currently producing a queer film through Nebula called Identities, and what fundamentally makes Nebula so appealing for creators like myself is there isn't the same gatekeeping that limits videos but still offers the same kind of quality media hosting. Right now, one of my early access videos, me talking about the queer representation in New Charmed and how Menedez. I was really inspired by Rowan Ellis's video talking about the lackluster queer rep in Ted Lasso, and it just made me think about stuff. And so it's a very late Pride entry, but it is currently right now on Nebula. Originally, this video had a different sponsor, but they asked to be moved because of the subject matter. It is one of the many things that makes it sometimes difficult to do content that I like on an ad-supported platform. Nebula, thankfully, doesn't have that problem. Creators own it, and it makes it so that videos don't have to be limited. And it's the unfortunate reality that if you are talking about race, politics, gender, and rape culture, you will get limited ads, and it will hurt what creators are able to put out. And there has to be this sort of I don't think it's inherently bad, but it has to be a certain level of censorship to do that. Hell, my most recent YouTube short is also on limited ads. Why? I don't know. I guess it's maybe because my boobs look really good in it. And so I'm thankful for Nebula, not just for stepping in to sponsor this video, but for continuing to allow me to be able to have a space where if people want to see those videos and have the uncut versions of them up there, I'm able to do so. Thank you to Nebula. And again, if you want to see my latest video about the many mediocre relationships of Mel Vera, click on the link down below, and I will see you soon. In Bill James's very well-known work, Popular Culture Reflections on the Celebration of Violence, he says of the victim, Jose Menendez, he was a Cuban immigrant who made a fortune estimated at 14 to 15 million, working somewhere in the back rooms of the entertainment industry. He was a hard-driving, aggressive man who lectured his sons on the virtues of ruthlessness. He may also have sexually abused them if you believe the testimony of his sons. When he talks about the brothers in this, he calls them twerps and essentially co-signs the idea that they killed for money. I didn't really enjoy this that much, despite it being recommended by some folks that I really respect, including my beloved Gillian Flynn, feature a video topic, because it feels like a book on crime written in 2011, which it was. It came out before the new Jim Crow and the murder of Trayvon Martin. Both things I think that really, in my mind, changed the conversation around true crime and carceral thinking. So I just feel like this is sort of dated in its ideology about a lot of the people it's talking about. He's also a consultant for the Red Sox, and I'm a Yankee baby, so... But I think what's really interesting about what we know is that because the crime was considered so absolutely horrific, it at first was thought about being a gang-related crime. There were 15 rounds shot into the bodies of both Jose and Kitty, and people originally thought it was either gangs or business rivals, and it wasn't until later that the brothers became primary suspects, mostly because they were spending a lot of money. They estimatedly spent about $700,000 of his fortune. Lyle, who was 21 at the time of the murders, got a Rolex, a Porsche, a lot of clothing. Erik got a Jeep Wrangler, a $50,000 professional tennis racket, and a investment in a rock concert that never happened, so I guess he got Fire Festival or something. There were two trials for the brothers. One, they were tried separately and it ended in a mistrial and a hung jury. And then the second one is when they were found guilty for life without the possibility of parole. And the important thing about this case, because I don't want to get into the minutia of it because I don't really feel like that I can handle it. I'll put all the information down below. You can do your own reading about it. But I really want to talk about the big difference between the two cases. And the biggest one is that during the first trial, they were allowed to talk about the alleged sexual abuse that the boys faced. They brought in 58 witnesses that were attesting to the abusive nature of the parents, to the fact that they had spoken about being sexually abused by their father to other people at different points in their life, and that their father was a bully and abusive emotionally, physically, and the defense sort of just illustrated that very clearly. Both brothers took the stand, and that allowed them to bring in all of these witnesses to attest to this reality. The prosecution, they never really pushed back against the experts who were saying this, and therefore it led to, when the jury was deliberating, a lot of people really being split about, was there sexual violence? And that element was very important because essentially during that first trial, the brothers were up to first-degree murder, second degree, and manslaughter. Those were really the three that the jury was looking at. And at the end of it, it became like I believe for one, it was 9-3, and another one, it was 6-6. And there were holdouts on all sides. And the source I read for this book was Robert Rand's The Menendez Murders, The Shocking Untold Story of the Menendez Family and the Killings That Stunned a Nation. Because he wrote this in 2018, but he also wrote articles about the case while it was taking place. He was supposed to write a profile on Jose Menendez before any of this even took place. So he's been following it from pretty much the ground up. So he's been intimately involved. And I would say that he does seemingly believe the brothers. And I think what is really interesting and what I found very modern about his take is that he very much says something that I do believe, which is that it is possible for them to be the victims of violence and also have done something absolutely heinous. We live in a modern era where there is much greater understanding of abuse and family violence than there was in 1993. Nothing should ever give you a free pass to kill your parents, but if there are mitigating circumstances, as there clearly were in this case, the resolution should be manslaughter and not murder, because we live in a more enlightened society. He brings up that if the brothers had been sentenced to manslaughter, they would have spent 20 years in jail. They've now been in jail for over 3 decades. My idea of it was that they kind of just made everything up whole cloth, that there was nobody speaking of it. And yet you get testimony from cousins, from other people saying that they were very abusive. One morning, Jose saw a 5-year-old Lyle race around the living room, unable to sit still. Jose shouted, "Stop," but Lyle didn't listen. Jose jumped up and grabbed Lyle, and then glared into the child's eye and whispered in his ear. Suddenly pale and trembling, Lyle wet his pants. Then Jose punched him hard in the chest with a closed fist, knocking the wind out of him, before rushing him down the hall to his room. Outraged, Peter followed closely behind, screaming at his brother-in-law, "That's no way to raise a child." "If you don't like it, leave," Jose told him. "This is my house. I'll raise my children any way I see fit." Marta again says that she couldn't understand why Kitty didn't seem to show much affection for her sons. Little things would set her off. Quote, "She would suddenly get very violent and throw things and bang things and scream at the kids," said Marta. "She would pick them up by the arm, just like Jose used to do, and shake them and throw them and send them to their room. Frequently, she called them idiot, stupid, or clumsy, after becoming frustrated over seemingly inconsequential things. She would yell at them for being scared, treat them badly," and this is friends saying this, family members, their coaches talking about how he would berate them constantly, and all of these things indicate that they did not have a healthy dynamic. One of the things that they say about Jose, that he expected the best perfection from them, that even when they were involved in lying and cheating and scheming, he would help them get out of it because he felt as if that's what he had to do because they were his sons. They were his legacy. And I think what's also very telling about the case is that a lot of the language from people, especially one of the prosecutors, is this idea that if these two boys were molested and then murdered their parents, they are being bad victims. And there is specifically a testimony from one of the prosecutors who was talking about their own father having grown up in an abusive environment, that he went up to be a upstanding citizen, that he went to go off and do all these things. And I find her testimony to be, on the one hand, very heart-wrenching, very sympathetic, and I get where it comes from. But I'm going to read it out loud, and I'm going to ask if you hear what I'm hearing. "For all the people who have been beaten within an inch of their lives, for all the children who have been scalded with hot water as punishment, who've been burned with cigarettes, who have been locked in rooms for days at a time, years at a time, and not fed, and for those children who got out of the house and made lives for themselves and became productive members of society, this defense is an offense. Individual responsibility for one's actions, is the hallmark of becoming an adult. We say adults are 18 years old. The brothers were adult men, not boys." I get that as a statement to make, especially if you, as the prosecutor, because this is a prosecutor, believe that they are lying. But what I hate about statements like this, and what I think is so telling about the era in which something like this would have been said, because it still gets said now, is that there is this mentality that you can be a victim of domestic abuse, childhood abuse, but you have to be good the whole time. Like I mentioned with Anne Hesh, you can be beaten, scalded, all those things, but you better be a good person. You better have risen to the highest peak. And when I hear things like that, I say, well, what about all the people who are very severely fucked up because of what their abusers put them through, because of their childhoods? And and the thing about it too, like, yes, they were rich and they had access to monetary delights. Does that make up for being allegedly molested from the age of 4? I don't think so. And I think it's so telling that we say in courts of law that first of all, that because they were 18 and 21, they're adults, and therefore they should have just left. Yeah. Everyone always says this about, like, when an 18-year-old is abused in their home. Like, you're 18, just leave. Like, leave with what? Leave with what? As if the ability to leave isn't beaten out of you at a certain point. They were completely dependent on their parents. They didn't have no job. What were they going to do? Because here's the implication, is that you need, if it's so bad, then you have to be brave enough to leave. Mind you, that victims of domestic violence have a hard time leaving. Imagine it's your parent that you have to leave. And, for example, if you are the older sibling of a younger sibling and you're about them. I don't understand it. I think I get it if they believe that they're lying, but the mentality that is being perpetuated is one that says that the only good kind of victim is the one that rises above their circumstances. Because you can be emotionally, sexually, mentally scarred for the rest of your life, but if you kill your abuser, you're not a good victim anymore. Sorry. Now you get to go to jail. And it's so funny because at one point they say that we don't give the death penalty to child molesters. And I was just like, is that the serve you think it is? Like, I mean, I know, and I understand that. But here's the thing. So you can molest a child and not go to jail for life. But if you are 18 years old and kill the person who molested you, you go to jail for life? And I talked about this on my Patreon in some behind the scenes footage, is that you get some insight from the jury. And what you see is that in one thing, it was very much split, where the men in one of the jury pools, none of the men believed the sexual molestation, but the women did, which I'm just like, wild. Hate that for them. And this overwhelming idea that there is that an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old can't be abused by their father. And I find that so sickening. You know, we talk about believing male victims of sexual violence. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important, because it's like they are insinuating that because these are two athletic men, that they should be able to just overpower their abuser, who is their father, who they have seen punch them in the face, allegedly, who they have seen torment them their entire lives. But they're just supposed to just fight back instantly. And I think about, in Bella's book about love, she brings up how parents have been conditioned to feel that they are allowed to do whatever they want to their child in order to punish them, teach them. And we tell them, the children, that that is love. You have in some people, the first person who ever put hands on you is also the person that you are told by society loves you unconditionally. And you are told that it is okay to do that because you love them. And this is in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, where people didn't even care about this shit as much as they do now. They may be unlikable. They may have spent a whole lot of money in a short amount of time, but I don't think that's indicative of something. And the second trial is interesting because here's the thing. OJ happened in between. So literally there's a moment where, like, the Menendez brothers and OJ are in jail at the same time. Wild. OJ's not guilty happened right in between this. So the LAPD, the LA District Attorney's Office, was taking it on all avenues. So they had to retry this. They could not let these boys get off with it. So they had to retry them. The boys are shady. Lyle, I think, like, asked their girlfriend to lie about something, and if he testified, they were gonna like just slaughter him on that. And so they never called him to testify, which meant that if he never testified, they couldn't bring in a whole slew of witnesses. So rather than 58, they had 23. And they really focused on trying to dismantle this idea. So they never really, so the jury never got any real background on the sexual violence that they alleged happened, which was very graphic, very painful. You can watch the court trial. I wouldn't. I would just read something, read the testimony if you're that interested. But so the majority of it, they weren't allowed to hear, the jury. And so within 4 days, they found the boys guilty, and people came and spoke to the defense, and they were found guilty. They were found guilty and sentenced to life without parole, which is where they are today.
You know, but what happened between the first trial and the second trial is the first trial, all of this evidence was allowed in, not the letter, obviously, that came after the fact a couple of years ago, as you mentioned. But there was a hung jury. Half of the jury found that they would have been not guilty of the murder. That wasn't going to, they weren't going to get acquitted. It was just that they would have had something that eliminated malice and imperfect self-defense, which would have given you a manslaughter. Before the second trial, and what happened in the interim was the acquittal of O.J. Simpson, the judge in this case, same trial judge, reversed himself, and he actually invited the prosecution to reverse themselves, got into the second trial, did not give the imperfect self-defense, excluded much of the evidence of the abuse, and then probably most, the coup de grace really for them, engineering the guilty, was allowing the prosecutor to get up in closing and argue that it was an abuse excuse, that they had just made it up.
And I've already touched on it before. I think that it's just so, it's kind of heartbreaking to me. Not for them specifically, but what cases like this do in the public eye. How they frame things like allegations of abuse as a joke. The ways in which they're trying to clock whether someone's being genuine or not. The way that we ask questions of like, well, why didn't you leave? Or why didn't you do this? And I get that their whole idea was like the parents aren't around to defend themselves. I get that. But we have all of these witnesses saying that they were awful fucking parents. At minimum abusive, physically abusive and emotionally negligent parents. In the book, because the reporter is very much invested in this case, he ended up going to one of the aunt's homes and finding a letter that happened before the murders where Erik is talking to his cousin about the abuse restarting.
It's still happening, Andy, but it's worse for me now. I never know when it's going to happen, and it's driving me crazy. Every night, I stay up thinking he might come in. I need to put it out of my mind.
But the biggest thing was when the allegations by former Menudo member Roy Rossello came out. So in the Peacock series Menendez and Menudo Boys Betrayed, Roy Rossello claims that he was drugged and raped by Jose Menendez when he was around 13 to 14 years old. Menudo was a very popular Puerto Rican boy band that was one of the biggest boy bands in the world. One of the former members is Ricky Martin, who got his own shit going on. And I watched the docuseries, and I also understand why people might have been reluctant to watch it following the awful Casey Anthony documentary that they put out there just before. You stack up that evidence. She did that shit. New evidence not only shows that Jose Menendez was very much a violent, brutal man who sexually abused children, but it also strongly suggests, in fact, that he was still abusing Erik Menendez as late as 1988, which is what they said. They said that. Their cousins were saying it. People were saying this at trial. This is the thing that just got me. One of the jurors, who goes by Jude, talked about why they never believed the brothers. And they said, it was just the opinions of psychologists and psychiatrists who were paid to interview the brothers after they were incarcerated. I was looking for more corroboration of the molestation, and it never came, except for a hearsay from relatives that was unsubstantiated by facts. What evidence then qualifies? You ignore experts because you have doubts about expert testimony, which I get why. Law and Order has really, really horribly impacted the way people view expert witnesses. There are issues for sure, but like it has worser. So that happens. And then the testimony from relatives who are the closest people to the victim to know what would happen, you also exclude. They showed that there were some strangely graphic sexual photos that the father did take. So they even had those, and they were like, no, it's not enough. Ryan Murphy has planned for the second season of his monster series to be about the Menéndez brothers. And if it is made now, which only Atta Holland knows, girl, but it'll be the first media about the Menéndez brothers made after these revelations have been really made explicit. On Twitter, I asked if any of the big true crime podcasts, on X, I asked if any of the big true crime podcasts had covered the Menendez brothers post this documentary, and I didn't hear any response from a lot of people about that. They might just be waiting for more evidence to come out, and that's fine. I've said many times, because I've talked about true crime way more than I have ever planned to, despite being a born and raised snap girly, that it can both inform our society when being well done, but it can also cause people who have a very limited understanding on the legal system and psychology and all those kind of things to perpetuate misinformation. I also think that people are just much less rehabilitation minded than they want to be because they hyper worry about the extreme circumstances that happen and are outliers, because no one makes articles about all the people on parole who don't commit murder, who do change, because that's not a story. When it comes to cases like the Menendezes, it's worth reflecting on how the trial was handled. I find that so telling that there still is this idea like, well, they're not the right kind of victim. My favorite thing about true crime is finding out how pulp culture, because a part of it becomes pulp culture at a certain point, creates heroes, victims, and villains. And we just accept that until otherwise. It wasn't until last podcast on the left, I believe, did their two-parter on Lizzie Borden, also another future video topic, that I realized that she didn't she was accused of killing her parents, but A, the evidence not really there, and two, she didn't get fucking caught guilty about it. And I'm like, so she didn't kill her parents, and yet they had this nursery rhyme going around making me believe this. Everything I've ever seen about her plays the idea that she must have done it and then went off to become a lesbian or something like that. Like, you would think by the amount of media that frames Lizzie Borden as an axe murderer that she would have Casey Anthony levels of evidence and lies around her. But when you read the actual details of the case, it's not true. But it doesn't matter because the case has been over for over 100 years and there are still people who still believe that she killed her parents. That's madness. Because people aren't doing the research. They will not actually sit down and they'll just take whatever someone tells them and not read it. And here's the thing. I don't know the truth about the Menendez brothers case. Don't take my word for it. Do your own reading, do your research, come to your own conclusion. The point is to ask the questions. I think that if we're going to be taking things like domestic violence seriously and revisiting the cases where people have been in prison because of that, then victims of alleged childhood sexual abuse should be a part of that too. Just because they cross the threshold into adulthood doesn't make the voice go away. Hell, at 21 and 19, they date somebody in their 30s, they're going to be called like children who were being groomed. It's important. And I think this happens so often with people who are not rich. Take the case of Stacey Lannert. When she was 18 years old, she killed her father after allegedly 10 years of abuse that was being passed on to her younger sister. On the 4th of July in 1990, while her father was passed out from drinking, she shot him twice.
during the altercation that had happened, he took all the phones and ripped them out of the wall and had hid them. So when I went to go find a phone to save his life, I couldn't find it. And he started calling me all kinds of whores and bitches and told me to just wait until he got up from that couch. And I knew that if he ever got up, that we would die.
And there were people who knew about the abuse, the sister's babysitter, her sister. And despite that, the prosecutor for St. Louis County, Bob McCullough, he refuses to believe her allegations of abuse and maintains that she committed the murders for inheritance. He told ABC News, "I have not changed my mind at all about Stacey Leonard. She murdered her father for his inheritance and solely for his inheritance." He brings up that before she killed her father, she forged her name on checks, used his credit cards, and she knew that she would inherit his estate, which was apparently around $500,000. He also said that if she was being abused, she was 18, she could leave. Criminal justice system at work. Nearly 20 years in jail for killing someone who abused you since you were 9 because you did it while they were asleep and because you spent your abuser's money. Because under Missouri law at that time, quote, the self-defense argument was not valid because she was not in actual danger at the moment she pulled the trigger. Or if we go to a more well-known case, the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard, who was murdered by her daughter in collusion with another man, Rosalie. I can't say her full name because her first name is a fucking slur. First flag, because Dee Dee Blanchard had Munchausen by proxy and kept her daughter in a state of medical abuse for the majority of her life, pulled out her teeth, gave her medications that for conditions she didn't have, put a feeding tube in her that she didn't need, and Rose essentially used somebody else to help kill her mom because her mom was fucking abusing her for her entire life. She'll be eligible for parole at 32 years old, which is this year. She was 27 when it happened, but she didn't know her real age because her mother kept it a secret from her. And she's serving a 10-year sentence in a Missouri prison. Free that girl. If Dee Dee Blanchard was alive right now, she wouldn't be in jail. She wouldn't be in jail for 10 years. But her daughter, who helped do this because she needed to be free of her fucking abusive, insane, and I know that term can be ableist, but like categorically abusive and insane mother, she in jail. Free that child. Even if you don't believe that the Menéndez brothers were abused, you don't have to. Don't take my word for it again. Do your own research, come to your own conclusion. What does it do to have on a massive scale a prosecution being able to throw out that explanation of a defense when there are over 50 people willing to testify to it? To say there is no evidence and they just made it up wholesale when there are multiple family members who claim they saw something or heard something, especially when we're talking about a case, a situation, a thing that would be happening behind closed doors. Because if that is the standard, then nobody who is being abused in a way that is not going to the hospital, because again, you can't always go, so there's no medical records. It's not happening in public. The people who are in your home are being used to enable everything. What are you supposed to do? Die? And we all know that's really what they want, right? If you're dead, then you're actually a victim. If you're alive, then we gotta prosecute you. In summary, and if the entire prosecution can just say, "Oh, well, you spent your abuser's money." Sorry, I'm not fucking Peggy Olson. The money is not the thank you. Anyway, that's just my thoughts. Like I said, I will leave all the links and sources down below. Find your own opinions. What do you think? What do you think that we should be doing about the system? And how should we be treating and dealing with people who kill their abusers in situations where they're not in danger in this very moment, but live in a constant state of danger and are maybe taking an opportunity where they have the upper hand to escape? How do we deal with that? And how does the criminal justice system respond to that reality?